At this point, it's time to configure your vSphere HA cluster and all of the settings around vSphere HA. And we understand that a lot of that has to do with how we respond to failures. But it also has to do with how we implement redundancies, as well as how we can ensure that all of our virtual machines are able to be restarted in the event of a host failure. That is, what happens when I'm down a host and I don't have the resources of that host? Can I be sure that my cluster itself and all of the virtual machines running on that cluster have enough resources in the remaining healthy hosts to run my virtual machines appropriately? These are really important factors as we begin to learn how to configure our vSphere HA cluster. And when we're done here, we'll dive into the lab environment and look at it for ourselves. So we'll start by looking at the requirements for creating the HA cluster, and then we'll actually dive into the configuration. Okay, first, the requirements. All of our ESXi hosts for an HA cluster have to be configured with static IP addresses, or at the very least, IP addresses that don't change. So if you're using DHCP, for example, in a PXE booted cluster of ESXi hosts, then you've got to make sure you set up DHCP reservations so that the IP addresses don't change. This is because we're not doing name resolution when we execute these heartbeat networks. We're just hitting an IP address that's set up for your management VM kernel ports. Okay, and of course, all of the hosts in the cluster have to have a physical management network in common so that these network heartbeats can actually occur. Now, if you want to have virtual machine monitoring, we know that this is a VMware tools mechanism, so VMware tools has to be installed in all of the VMs. Virtual machine component protection, looking at losses of data store connectivity, was a feature that was introduced in vSphere 6.0. So all of your hosts have to be at least vSphere 6.0. Okay? Finally, you can't have more hosts in a cluster than we support. So you've got to have at least or at most 64 ESXi hosts in your cluster in order for HA to work. If you're interested in what all of those configuration maximums are, check out the website configmax.vmware.com. Okay, so I build my cluster, I drag my hosts into the cluster, and HA is enabled. Okay, let's now dive into the configuration of vSphere availability, which is found on the Cluster Configure tab by selecting vSphere HA. Okay, we're going to hit, or vSphere availability. We're going to hit the Edit button, and you're going to see all kinds of important things over here. We're going to first look at the failure and responses. What happens when a host fails? What happens when a host becomes isolated? What happens in our data stores if we have permanent device loss or all paths down? Do we want to enable virtual machine monitoring, for example? Do we want to enable host monitoring? And later, we'll have a look at admission control and heartbeat data stores and some of the advanced options that we have. So HA settings for failures and responses. Notice some of the defaults here. First of all, we want to enable host monitoring. Of course, we want to enable host monitoring. You might ask, why would there even be an option for host monitoring? Well, if you happen to be fooling around with your management networks and there's some loss of connectivity there, you can disable host monitoring so that there's no false positives and attempts to restart your virtual machines when the hosts are just fine. Okay, but how do we respond to host failures to restart VMs? Host isolation response is disabled. In other words, don't do anything with the VMs. Data store with permanent device loss, powering off and restarting VMs. Data store with all paths down response, power off and restart VMs conservatively versus aggressively. All of these things are failures and responses. Do we want to enable virtual machine monitoring? And by the way, the default here is that it is disabled. We can enable virtual machine monitoring only if we choose, and we can enable virtual machine and application monitoring as well. Now this is set at the cluster level. And if you remember from our discussion of DRS, there's a way that we can create individual virtual machine overrides. So if there are virtual machines that you decide, hey, I don't want to monitor all of them, just a select few, you can actually create overrides from the cluster settings for individual VMs later on. We'll come back to admission control in just a minute, okay? Let's skip over to data store heartbeats. We know that the data store heartbeats are important because it gives us an indication of, has a host actually failed versus has a host become isolated from the management network. Now, it's important then that each ESXi host has access to a data store on which to place a data store heartbeat file. And in fact, if we're avoiding single points of failure on the data stores, let's choose 2 data stores if we possibly can for each host. So there are some options that we have here. We can automatically select data stores accessible from the hosts, have HA do the job. We can use data stores only from the specified list and hit the little checkboxes that we want. Or we can say, use data stores from the specified list and complement automatically if needed. In other words, we'll choose the ones we want to use, but if there aren't at least 2 per host, we'll let HA choose more of them for us. So that's the heartbeat data stores. Now, we'll take a little bit of a break here, and we're going to come back and talk about this concept of admission control. To get you thinking about this, it's how do I ensure that all of my virtual machines, upon host failures, will be able to restart, okay? Think reservations for CPU and memory, and is there enough unreserved capacity? We'll be right back.